What does a woman want? This question haunted Sigmund Freud until his final days. But here's what most people don't know. In his private notebooks, away from public scrutiny, Freud wrote some of his most shocking observations about the female psyche, observations so intense, so brutal in their honesty, that they remained hidden in the shadows of his published work. Today, we're diving into Freud's secret diagnosis of the female mind, the one that reveals uncomfortable truths about desire, guilt, and the construction of feminine identity. Before we begin, subscribe if you want to understand the deepest layers of human psychology, and hit that notification bell, the mystery that consumed Freud. Picture this: the founder of psychoanalysis, the man who unlocked the secrets of the unconscious mind, spent decades analyzing dreams, neuroses, and human behavior. Yet there was one puzzle that remained unsolved until his death. What does a woman want? Freud himself admitted this was the great question of his life. But why? What did he discover in his clinical practice that made the female psyche such an enigma? The answer lies not just in his published theories, but in his private case notes, his personal letters, and his clinical observations that never made it into textbooks. These reveal a Freud who saw the female mind as a battleground, a space where desire, repression, and cultural conditioning created a psychological complexity that even he struggled to fully comprehend. Think of it this way: if the male psyche was like a map Freud could navigate, the female psyche was like an ocean with hidden currents, depths he could sense but never fully chart. Part 1: The Edible Wounded Women. To understand Freud's brutal diagnosis, we need to start with his most controversial theory, the female Oedipus complex. You know how everyone talks about boys wanting to marry their mothers? Well, Freud believed girls go through something even more psychologically complex. Here's how he saw it. A little girl's first love object is her mother, just like a boy's. But then comes the brutal awakening. She realizes she lacks something. Her father has died in Freudian terms. This creates what he called penis envy, but this isn't really about anatomy. It's about power, status, and cultural privilege. Think of it like this. Imagine growing up and suddenly realizing that half the population has access to a club you can never join, a club that holds most of the power in society. The psychological impact, according to Freud, is devastating. Here's where it gets dark. Unlike boys, who can identify with their fathers and eventually become them, girls face a more complex journey. They must transfer their love from mother to father, then later to other men, all while navigating feelings of inadequacy and resentment. In his private notes, Freud observed that this early wound never fully heals. He wrote that many of his female patients carried a deep, unconscious rage, not just at individual men, but at the entire structure of society that positioned them as lacking. But here's the kicker: they also often turned this rage inward, creating patterns of self-sabotage, depression, and what we might today call imposter syndrome. Part 2: The Prison of Cultural Repression. Now, let's talk about what Freud really observed about women and desire, the parts that made even his colleagues uncomfortable. In his clinical practice, Freud noticed something disturbing. Women seem to carry a disproportionate burden of psychological symptoms: hysteria, anxiety, depression, physical ailments with no medical cause. Why? His brutal diagnosis: women were psychologically imprisoned by cultural expectations that demanded they repress their most fundamental drives. Think about it this way. Imagine you're constantly hungry, but society tells you that eating is shameful. You develop a pretty complicated relationship with food, right? Freud saw women's relationship with their own desires, sexual, professional, creative, in exactly this way. In his private observations, he noted that his female patients often displayed what he called reaction formation, becoming extremely moral, self-sacrificing, or pure as a way to cover up forbidden desires. The perfect Victorian lady, in Freud's view, was often the most psychologically tormented. He wrote about women who came to him with mysterious ailments, paralyzed hands that prevented them from writing, sudden blindness with no medical cause, chronic fatigue that kept them bedridden. What did these symptoms have in common? They all prevented the women from fully participating in life. Freud's brutal insight: these weren't medical problems, they were unconscious rebellions. The psyche was creating physical symptoms to express what the conscious mind couldn't: rage at being trapped, desire for freedom, and protest against suffocating social roles. Part 3. The hidden notes: what Freud really wrote. Here's where it gets really intense. In Freud's personal case files and letters to colleagues, we find observations that paint an even darker picture of his understanding of female psychology. He wrote about the masochistic tendency he observed in many women, not in a judgmental way, but as a psychological adaptation to impossible circumstances. When you can't fight the system directly, sometimes turning the aggression inward becomes a survival mechanism. One of his most disturbing observations involved what he called the maternal ambivalence. He noticed that many mothers harbored unconscious resentment toward their daughters, seeing in them either a reminder of their own lost possibilities or a competitor for male attention and resources. But perhaps his most brutal insight concerned female sexuality itself. Freud observed that many women seem to experience desire as fundamentally problematic, something that brought pleasure, but also shame, connection, but also vulnerability. He noted in his private writings that female patients often described feeling split, as if they contained a different people, the good woman society approved of, and the desiring, ambitious, sometimes angry woman they had to hide. This split, Freud believed, was at the root of what we now call the good girl syndrome, the exhausting performance of perfection that leaves women feeling like frauds in their own lives. Part 4. The resistance to female power. Now we get to perhaps Freud's most pressing observation, one that explains why his theories about women were so controversial, even among his own followers. Freud believed that society had a vested interest in keeping women psychologically fragmented. Why? Because a woman who fully integrated her shadow, her anger, her ambition, her sexuality, her power, would be a threat to existing power structures. Think about this. Even today, we have terms like bossy for assertive girls, difficult for women who set boundaries, and crazy for women who express anger. Freud saw this centuries ago. In his private correspondence, he wrote about observing what he called the cultural conspiracy against female wholeness. This wasn't some paranoid theory. It was a clinical observation based on pattern after pattern. In his practice, He noticed that women who began to integrate their repressed aspects often faced intense social backlash. Families would pressure them to return to therapy. Husbands would threaten divorce. Communities would ostracize them. The message was clear: stay fragmented or face exile. But here's what's really shocking. Freud observed that women often collaborated in their own repression. They would make progress in analysis, begin to feel more whole and powerful, then suddenly develop new symptoms or find reasons to quit therapy. Why? Because on some unconscious level, they had internalized the message that their full power was dangerous, not just to others, but to themselves. Part 5. The price of psychological imprisonment. So what did Freud see as the ultimate cost of this psychological imprisonment? His observations were stark and brutal. He noted that many women seemed to live what he called half-lives, going through the motions of existence, while their true selves remained buried in the unconscious. They might appear successful on the surface, but underneath, they were slowly dying. Freud observed patterns that we still recognize today: the perfect mother who secretly resents her children, the devoted wife who fantasizes about escape, the accomplished professional who feels like an imposter, the selfless daughter who burns with hidden rage. But perhaps most brutally, he noticed how this repression was passed down through generations. Mothers who had buried their own desires often unconsciously sabotaged their daughters' attempts at freedom, perpetuating cycles of psychological limitation. He wrote about observing what he called the inheritance of female wounds, how trauma, repression, and cultural conditioning were transmitted not through genes, but through unconscious patterns of relating. Part 6. Freud's solution, the path to integration. Despite these dark observations, Freud wasn't pessimistic about women's potential for psychological freedom. In fact, he believed that women had a unique capacity for psychological depth and integration if they could overcome the cultural barriers to self-knowledge. His solution wasn't to fight against feminine nature, but to reclaim it fully. This meant bringing unconscious conflicts into conscious awareness. Through what he called the talking cure, Freud believed that women needed to, first, acknowledge the rage, not pretty it up, not rationalize it away, but face the full intensity of anger at being culturally diminished. This rage, he observed, was often the key to unlocking authentic power. Second, integrate the shadow. This meant owning the parts of themselves they've been taught to hide: ambition, sexuality, selfishness, anger, competitiveness, not acting them out destructively, but acknowledging them as legitimate parts of the psyche. Third, grieve the unlived life. Freud noticed that healing often involved mourning the woman. They might have been in a different world, the dreams they'd abandoned, the risks they hadn't taken, the voice they'd silenced. Finally, choose authenticity over approval. This was perhaps the most difficult step, learning to tolerate disapproval from others, rather than continue the exhausting performance of being the good woman. Part 7. The modern relevance. Here's what's shocking. Many of Freud's observations about women remain eerily relevant today. Sure, women have more legal rights and opportunities than in his time, but the psychological patterns he identified persist. We still see women struggling with imposter syndrome, people-pleasing, perfectionism, and the exhausting split between public and private selves. We still see women who achieve external success but feel empty inside, or who sabotage themselves just as they're about to break through. Modern research in psychology has validated many of Freud's clinical observations. Even if we understand the mechanisms differently, we now know about internalized oppression, intergenerational trauma, and the psychological impact of systemic inequality. But here's what Freud got right that many contemporary approaches miss. He understood that individual healing isn't enough. The cultural conditions that create these psychological splits need to change too. His brutal diagnosis wasn't meant to pathologize women. It was meant to expose the pathology of a culture that systematically fragments half the population. The question that still haunts us, so we return to Freud's original question: what does a woman want? Based on his clinical observations, his brutal, honest answer might have been, she wants to be whole. She wants to integrate all parts of herself without apology. She wants to desire without shame, to succeed without guilt, to be angry without being labeled crazy, and to be powerful without being punished. But perhaps the more important question is, what does it cost a society to prevent women from having what they want? Freud's hidden diagnosis suggests the cost is enormous, not just for women, but for everyone. When half the population lives fragmented lives, everyone suffers from the loss of their full potential. The real brutality in Freud's observations wasn't his analysis of women. It was his exposure of a culture so threatened by female wholeness that it would systematically damage half its members to maintain control. What do you think? Do Freud's observations still ring true today? Have you noticed these patterns in your own life or in the women around you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this helped you understand something new about psychology or yourself, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the human psyche. Remember, the goal isn't to blame or judge, but to understand. Because only by making the unconscious conscious can we begin to heal these ancient wounds.